The Week in Bible Prophecy, a Prophecy Watchers podcast.
Hi, I'm Gary Stearman, and I have across the table from me an author. His name's Tim Chaffey, and he's written a book called Fallen, and we're going to talk about fallen angels and a whole lot more, right, Tim?
That's right. Gary, thanks for having me on. It's a privilege.
It's a privilege to have you here because this book is an example of how to do deep research. And you've done a lot of research on the sons of God and the Nephilim in the Bible. And I think in the days in which we live, people are coming up with a lot of questions about that. And maybe a few decades ago, Christians didn't look that deeply into the Bible on this subject.
I think that's true. I think part of that is probably due to the rise of the internet and social media. You're able to find materials that you never would have been able to find before. And so there's more books being written. Unfortunately, a lot of times I think they focus on the fantastical or the sensational rather than just a detailed biblical study on the topic, which is what I wanted to do. But the internet has allowed us to realize there are a lot of other people who think about these weird things like I do, and they want to know about it too. And whereas before, publishers were like, that's not going to sell. We don't need to do that. But the Bible talks about this subject quite a bit, and so there are a lot of questions about it.
Well, in Genesis 6, the sons of God came into the daughters of men, took wives, and it's a very simple statement. Mm-hmm. Not much to it, no details, but right. It raises a multitude of questions. Mm-hmm. And in a way, that's what your book is all about, right?
That's right, yeah. So the first half of the book is all about who are those sons of God, because that is a debated topic within the church. And then the second half is who are the Nephilim.
Okay. Who are those sons of God? Now, that's a huge question.
It is.
And I'm thinking of a lot of TV I've seen lately speculating on ancient peoples and ancient mythology and linking it to maybe some of the UFO appearances and saying they're back. Those same angels that used to fall down or have come down on planet Earth are now coming down in their UFOs. And you hear all kinds and every kind of mixture you can think of on this subject lately. But, of course, what we want is the truth as expressed in the Bible.
Right. And so that was my goal, is to filter out a lot of that noise of all of the modern speculation, modern sensationalism, if you will. It doesn't mean that all of that is necessarily wrong, but let's just look at what does the Bible actually tell us.
Yeah, well, give it a go here. Where would you start?
Well, first, we've got to identify who the sons of God are, who are the daughters of men. And when you look at that terminology, it tells us when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives from whomever they chose. So the sons of God, that's the first time that wording appears in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And there are three primary views that Christians have held for the last 2,000 years. One is the earliest view that we know of is that they were angelic beings who rebelled against God, married women, and had children by them. And most people who hold that view would say that the Nephilim, the giants, were the children from those unions. That was the earliest Christian view, was the earliest Jewish view as far as we know. And then around the beginning of the 2nd century, another view came about from some Jewish rabbis, and it was what we call the royalty view or the divine kings view. These were kings who viewed themselves as divine, or there were judges who viewed themselves as divine, and their children, the sons of those divine beings, these people who viewed themselves as divine, the sons were taking wives into their harems, and so the sin there would be like polygamy. And that's why they were judged for that. It doesn't really explain why they would have giant offspring. There are a lot of other problems with that as well. But the third view, and the one that's been dominant in church history from about the time of Augustine, so late 4th century, early 5th century, up until about the last 100 years, is that the sons of God were actually men from the line of Adam to Noah through Adam's son Seth. So they call this the Sethite view. Mm-hmm. And then the daughters of men were the women in the line of Cain. And so what the sin there was, according to this view, is that the sons of God, the descendants of Seth, were intermarrying to a believer marrying unbelievers, what the view says. And so that was the problem. So those are the three major views. And so what I do in the book is I lay out each case and I say, here's the arguments for each one. Here's the arguments against it. And I think the first one I mentioned, the fallen angel view, is the only one that holds up to any scrutiny.
And the dominant portion of the book is devoted to explaining that, the
Yes.
angelic view, right?
That's right. So I spend several chapters. I think there are 4 chapters that deal with the arguments for that position from Scripture, both Old Testament, New Testament, also church history. And then there are 5 chapters dealing with the objections to that view, because I want to make sure everybody's objections are heard. I've heard a lot of them, and if people read the book, they're probably going to think, I've never even heard of that one before, but I'm glad he included it because I'm wondering how he would explain it. But the other ones, I think, have fatal flaws. So the Sethite view and the royalty view, I think the text rules them out pretty easily. And I think a lot of times the reason people adopt those is they're uncomfortable with the fallen angel view. It's not because of what the text does or doesn't say. It's more of a gut feeling reaction to it, that they don't like it.
Well, you have mighty men of old in the King James Version. What came out of these unions with sons of God are called mighty men of old, men of renown. Who are those mighty men, and who are those men of renown?
Yeah, so the beginning of verse 4 says the Nephilim, or the giants. That the word Nephilim just means giants. People will try to say, oh, it means fallen ones. No, it doesn't. And I go through that in the book. It doesn't mean fallen ones.
You do spend a lot of time on that question. By the way, what does that, we call it Nephilim, from Nephal?
Well, people argue that it's from Nephal, but it's not.
But it's not.
It's not.
And I remember that you spend a lot of time on that question.
Yeah, because it destroys a lot of the other arguments. People will base their entire idea on
But that's
this.
what I hear all the time.
It's all over the internet. It's on podcasts. It's all over. But you know where you won't find it?
Where?
Hebrew English lexicons.
Ah.
You won't find it in academic commentaries.
Wow.
You won't find scholars saying it. You'll find pop theology saying it. And it's not that they're always wrong, but if the linguistic scholars are saying, no, it doesn't mean that, and the academic, the people who make a living and study this their whole career are saying it doesn't mean that. But the language itself shows that it can't be from the verb nafal, because if you wanted to turn that into a participle, which is you're going to be using this verb as a noun, it either because the way the Hebrew language works, it morphs the morphology, so that the letters change, the vowels change a little bit. It becomes Nophilim or Nephulim with a U. It does not become Nephilim. So the word Nephilim is actually from an Aramaic noun, Nephil, and when you make that plural in Aramaic, it's Nephilim.
So Nephil rather than Nephal.
Right. And Nephil just means giant. And
okay.
So Nephilim is plural of giant. It means giants.
Plural of giants. Okay. Yeah. So that kind of puts us on course here to begin the discussion.
And so that's who those mighty men were, because it tells us the Nephilim, the giants, were on the earth in those days. Now remember, Moses is writing this.
Yeah.
So he says in those days, talking about before the flood, and also afterward. So before the flood and after the flood, whenever the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them, these are the mighty men of old, men of renown. So the offspring of those unions were giants.
Now Moses was in a really good position to know that history.
Yes.
Having grown up in Egypt as part of a very important family in Egypt, and himself a notary, a personality. He was very well known, very well respected. Apparently, I've read from secular history that Moses actually was a general in the Egyptian army, and is credited with having fought a battle and won. And he was called a hero in battle. And you don't read that in the Bible, but you do find it in little tidbits of history here and there. Whether true or not, that we can discuss that. But the point is, Moses is writing from that perspective, and you sort of have to listen to him when he puts these things down.
Right. So Moses is, if you think about when he's writing this, it's probably during the wilderness wandering. So it is, yes, he spent 40 days on Mount Sinai with the Lord, and that's where you get Exodus 20 and some of the law. But then a lot of Genesis and some of the other books are being written during that wilderness wandering, that 40 years. And they sent the spies into the land before that, and they're supposed to spy it out. And they come back talking about giants, talking about Nephilim in the land. And so Moses is talking about, here's how these people got here. let me take you back to Genesis chapter. I'll tell you what happened before the flood. By the way, they were here before. They're also hereafter. And how did it happen? Well, it's whenever the sons of God did this activity, that's how you get the Nephilim on the earth. And so he gives us that. The other thing that it happens in that same context, and we often skip over verse 3 of Genesis 6, where it talks about the Lord said, my spirit will not strive with man or dwell in man forever, for he is indeed flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Moses, think about where this passage is positioned. It's right after Genesis 5, where Adam lives 930 years and he died. Seth lives 912 years and he died. Skip down a little ways, Methuselah 969 years and he died. And all of these guys are over 900 years old. If you're an Israelite wandering in the wilderness and hearing that for the first time, what question are you asking? How come we don't live so long? How come these guys used to live over 900 years? Mm-hmm. And then right after that, you get this passage, the sons of God and the Nephilim. And in verse 3, God says, your days are going to be 120. And what you see from that point on is a drop. You have Noah living 950 years. Next generation is 600. Then it's into the 400s, all the way down to Moses, who lives 120 years. And since Moses, how many people have lived 120 years? Just Jehoiada the priest, 130 years. Other than that, nobody reaches that.
True.
And so I think it was God's way of saying, look, I let you live. You're supposed to live forever, but you ate the fruit, you're going to die. And now you're not going to live more than 1,000 years. At least that's what we see in Genesis 5. So he reduced their lifespans. And then look how wicked people become if we let them live 900 years. So now to curb that wickedness, you're dropping down to 120. And that's what we see. So I think that this topic explains that as well.
So Moses writes about the mighty men which were of old. Mm-hmm. And of course, Moses himself is a landmark figure. And he was hated but respected. And I remember, when you read about Moses in secular history or in Greco-Roman histories, touch on Moses occasionally and say things that, did that really happen or not? But he was a legendary figure. Mm-hmm. I think even to people scattered around the world at his time, a powerful, powerful man. So when he makes this statement, and he's talking about mighty men which were of old, men of renown, he is pointing you to something for a reason here. And that something is still being debated very assiduously.
Yeah, it could be a reference to, you look at Greco-Roman history, you look at the Greek gods on Olympus, and the Romans kind of had the same gods, just gave them different names. But you got Norse mythology and all sorts of different mythologies that have the gods coming down and having affairs with women and producing demigods, mighty men like Hercules and Theseus and some of these other ones. Even the Amazons, according to some tradition, like the women who were, some of them have them as demigods. And so you have these mighty beings that are talked about in these different cultures. And I think what those are, I call them echoes of reality, echoes of history. So that it's like mankind had a shared history up till Babel, up in Genesis chapter 11. They had they got off the ark, and those people, rather than scattering like they're supposed to, they went to the plain of Shinar, and they're building the city and a tower. And so they had the same history at that point. But then when they scatter, they start to pass that history down generation after generation, and it gets distorted over the years. Yeah. But that kernel of truth is still there. So you have a whole bunch of things from Genesis 1 through 11 that these ancient cultures share, even though they're distorted in many ways. So the creation of man from the dust of the ground, man dies or becomes sinful because of something to do with a tree and or a serpent. A worldwide flood is all over the place. That's hundreds of those legends have that. Even Babel legends, we've found about 23 of those. But the other thing that occurs in a lot of them is the gods coming down and mating with women and producing giants or demigods. And so I think what we see there is echoes of the real history, which is recorded for us in Genesis.
Yeah, what I would like to say at this point is, not only when you're looking at Genesis 6, not only do you suddenly come to the flood, mighty men which were of old, men of renown, and then just very quickly we turn to the ungodly being destroyed in the flood, and the godly and it begins with these words: Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, which is the biggest turn of history you can possibly think of.
The incredible wickedness, and Noah found grace.
And Noah found grace. And I explicitly believe, in the story of Noah and the ark and the global flood.
For the record, I do too. I work at the Ark Encounter.
As a matter of fact,
I've done a little bit of research on that topic.
You've done a little bit of research on the flood, and you basically, and we can talk for a moment about that.
Yeah.
You meet people, you talk to people, they have a lot of questions. What's the number one question about the flood and all those animals and that big boat and so forth?
You hit on both of them right there. People will always ask, especially skeptics will ask, but even Christians will wonder, how could he fit all those animals on the ark? And how could you build something so big? And then once they go and visit the Ark Encounter, which I would encourage everybody to do, and of course the best part's my writing, but no, okay. but just to see it, when you see how large it is built to the biblical scale, and you begin to realize, you could fit a lot on there. And when you realize what animals he actually had to bring on board the ark, it wasn't millions and millions like so many people throw out there. Once they start to think through this topic in a way that makes sense of the text, in a way that makes sense of reality, they realize this is feasible. This could happen. And one thing I don't remember if I said it at the beginning of the show, but I should probably mention it here. If people recognize me from the Ark Encounter, the Creation Museum, as the content manager there, what I'm talking about today is my own personal view. As a ministry, Answers in Genesis doesn't take an official view on the sons of God and the Nephilim. We have a non-position position. So I just don't want people to think that, Tim's speaking on behalf of the ministry at that point. No, this is my own view, and it's the right one. And
there you go. I know you believe in the right view, because you've got this book entitled Fallen, which is, I have to say, some of the most detailed grammatical research I've ever seen. And by grammatical, I'm looking at the sons of God, and the way you have followed that down through grammatical history to determine just exactly who these sons of God were. And it's a grammatical work of art, I have to say.
Yeah. So if you look at the rest of the Bible, that the wording there in Hebrew is B'nai Elohim. It's just sons of God or sons of the gods, depending on how you want to translate Elohim there. It's used 3 times in Job, Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and 38:7. And we know for a fact in 38:7 it's referring to angelic beings. God is talking about while he's creating the world, and he asked Job, were you there when this happened? Then he says, when the sons of God shouted for joy and the morning stars sang together, or maybe it's the other way around. But they're angelic beings watching what's taking place when God is creating. And then in Job 1 and Job 2, it's talking about when when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. They're clearly angelic beings in this passage, in all 3 of those passages. And so when you go back to Genesis and you see the only other time that phrasing is used is in Genesis 6:2, 6:4, and also Deuteronomy 32:8 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you see that mirrored in the Septuagint. It also uses it. It clearly is referring to angelic beings. So to suddenly turn that into these are godly men, well, the Bible tells us that only Noah was righteous before God. The rest of the people at that time weren't godly. And if these men were so godly, like the Sethite view says, why did they keep marrying ungodly women? I mean, sure, that happens from time to time, but why would that continually happen? And why would there's so many problems with that Sethite view from a grammatical, textual perspective. Why, if you look at those 2 lines like they do, the line from Cain and the line from Seth, why do they narrow it down to just 2? Adam and Eve had a lot of other sons and daughters too, it says in Genesis 5:4. So why only 2? And how come the line where they want the daughters to be from is the line that never mentioned daughters, but the line with Seth mentions sons and daughters in every generation? And so it doesn't make sense of the immediate context at all. It has to use something from the New Testament, this idea that believers are called sons of God. Except for whenever the New Testament speaks of that, in nearly every case, it's something future. It's something that will be revealed when the sons of God are revealed, as Romans 8 talks about. It's something that we're longing for when we're looking forward to that. So positionally, yes, we are sons of God.
Now, but you mentioned Job, and Job begins with Satan and some of his henchmen being instructed by the Lord, who presents Job as a case, case in question. And he says, I would like for you to look at my servant Job down here, see what you... And the whole book of Job is an instruction on the interaction between the devil and humanity, and where God, the love of God, interposes itself. And in a way, that's the story we're looking at in Genesis. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, God did not destroy Satan. He did not destroy all those evil ones, but rather allowed them to continue in an interaction that lasted and is still lasting. But they are going to be destroyed at some point in the future. So we're part of that long, long story.
Yeah, and Jude and 2 Peter both tell us that the angels who sinned, and 1 Peter 3:18 and 20 says it as well, those angels that sinned in Noah's day are being held in chains of darkness until that day of judgment. So they were allowed to run around and do their thing for a while, but eventually God said enough. And those ones are incarcerated until the end. But other ones are still roaming around, still doing their deceptive ways, and God allows that, just like He allows human beings to be sinful, to do wicked things, and in a sense they're heaping judgment upon themselves. But He's also patient and giving them time to turn to Him. He
allows them to sin, but there is still grace.
Yes,
and who can plumb the depths of the love of God? I mean, it's phenomenal.
Yeah,
and which is the central message of the Bible, by the way. But the evil that comes about in the rebellion, the original big rebellion that we read about, and all of the subsequent rebellions down through the Old Testament and into the New, really set the scene. And there's always a side story out here, which is what I'm interested in, because when I read your book, I couldn't help thinking about the video productions that are going on these days, DVDs, television programs on supernatural. Everybody's kind of in love with the supernatural, whether it's hunting ghosts, hunting Bigfoot, looking up in the sky to see if we can find supernatural beings coming down and landing on planet Earth. And they're all looking for a savior. They want something to come down and kind of save mankind. And then when you go to the sci-fi world, science fiction movies, one after another, all have that sub-theme of man being saved by superior technology or whatever. And you have a hero or a group of heroes. And people love that. And so you go back to the Bible, you look at that Bible story, and you say, wow, heroes. Job. And by the way, Job is one of my heroes.
Yeah.
He went through that, and God used him to illustrate a particular point about His grace. And but it's intermixed with the story of the sons of God commingling with the daughters of men. That whole story, it kind of filters through the Old Testament into the New. And so I notice here in chapter 8, you have the Old Testament fallen angel view, the New Testament, ancient Jewish support for the fallen angel view, and early Christian support for the fallen angel view. So this story is kind of traceable down through history.
It is. And so I included, for each of the views, I gave the best arguments that were out there for the view, and then I critiqued the views. And so when it came to the fallen angel view, there are 4 chapters worth of evidence or arguments for the position. You have Old Testament arguments. I gave a few already, but there's one other that I didn't mention in Daniel 3:25. You mentioned one of your heroes, Job. Daniel's one of my heroes. Yes. And so you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace. And then Nebuchadnezzar sees a 4th one who looks like the son of God or a son of the gods, depending on your translation. The Aramaic, that's one section of Daniel that's actually written in Aramaic, not Greek. It's Bar Elohim is the word that's used there. It's the Aramaic equivalent of B'nai Elohim. And then he says 3 verses later, for God has sent His angel to rescue them. So Nebuchadnezzar equates the sons of God, the Bar Elohim or B'nai Elohim, with angels. So even in that passage, you that mindset for the Hebrews, and I know that Nebuchadnezzar is not a Hebrew, but a Hebrew is writing that. And so that is the position of the Jewish people in the Old Testament. We know from the ancient intertestamental writings, not just the Book of Enoch, but and some of these other ones, but there are a whole bunch of ancient intertestamental writings that all had this view. And whenever they talked about it, it was the fallen angel view. The early church fathers, up until about the third century, middle of the third century, that they had this view as well.
Let me run something past you here that just happened to come into my mind while you were talking, and it may or may not be a suitable topic to fit into this discussion, but we read about principalities and powers and rulers of darkness in heavenly places in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. In other words, there's still a large contingent of negative forces out there, and they're very, very busy. And where do they fit in this discussion?
I think that's a great question, and it's one thing that I wish I would have elaborated on more in the book. In fact, I've thought about adding one chapter or an appendix on this. One thing, when we have an exhibit at the Creation Museum called Biblical Authority, and one of the things we do in that, we're moving you through biblical history and showing you some of the archaeological evidence, but one of the themes that I traced throughout the Bible is the way that the God of Scripture, Yahweh, the Creator, the one true God, demonstrates his authority and his power over not just the nations, not just kings and rulers, but also the gods of those nations. So you look at Exodus 12:12, when God says, I'm going to execute my judgment against the gods of Egypt. All 10 of those plagues were an attack on the Egyptian gods, who are supposed to be protecting the children, who are supposed to be protecting, or supposed to be the sun god. Well, it goes dark for 3 days. Who are all of these different gods. Yeah. And what the true God is showing is, they can't stop me. I'm going to systematically take out each one of them. But it wasn't just Egypt. That happened when they go into the land of Canaan. Think about what happened with Dagon. When the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant, Dagon falls down on his face right before it. They prop him back up. The next morning, he's fallen down again. This time his arm's broken off and everything. Right. And they said, we need to get him out, get this Ark out of here. And so over and over and over again in the Old Testament and in the New, you see how Yahweh, the one true God, is showing his power over the nations, over the peoples, and over the gods of those nations, who are these principalities and powers, who are supposed to be, when you read Deuteronomy 32, God he gave them, the sons of God. Deuteronomy 32:8 talks about, and there's a variant there in the Hebrew where Masoretic text has the sons of Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate it by over 1,000 years, the Septuagint always have sons of God, or angels of God. At Babel, God divided the nations up, and he placed them under the authority of these sons of God. And they were supposed to rule well. They were supposed to be just. They were supposed to be caring for the oppressed, but they didn't. Instead, they abused their authority. If you read Psalm 82, you read about that judgment that God pronounces on them, and says that, I said you are gods. That's the line that Jesus quotes in John 10. Yes. And he's quoting Psalm 82. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any one of the princes. And so in Psalm 82, this is known as that divine council passage that some people might be familiar with, where it says, God takes his stand in the divine council. He judges among the gods. And a lot of times people will try to make that about judges in Israel or about other things. That's not what's going on there. And it's a judgment on these angelic beings, these powers that the Bible calls gods. They're not eternal. They're not omnipotent or anything. They're not the one true God, but they're angelic beings, principalities and powers that God gave them an opportunity and they blew it. And so he announces judgment there. And then you see the same sort of thing going on in the New Testament when Paul and Silas, they what do they think? They're Zeus and Hermes, or Hermes and Zeus. So you still have this interaction with these pagan gods going on, and God demonstrates his authority over them.
You mentioned here the divine council, but in the very next breath, you also talk about polytheism, and you're suggesting that the divine council should not be in any way interpreted as being polytheistic.
Right. Yeah. So polytheism, if you think of more like the Greek Olympian gods, they're all kind of on the same level. They're just a multitude of gods that exist, and they're all on the same level. What we're talking about is, I think Michael Heiser used this term, monotheism. There's one true all-powerful God. He's eternal. He's the creator, and he's made everything else. And so these other quote-unquote gods, lowercase g, if you will, they're angelic beings, but the Bible's not afraid to call them gods. In fact, you look at the commandments, you shall have no other gods before me.
Right.
And so over and over again, it uses that terminology. And I think a lot of times in the West, as Christians, we get nervous about that. Like, well, no, there's only one God. And it's like, there's one God, capital G. True. Yes.
True.
But the other one, the Bible still refers to these other entities as gods. And I don't think we need to be afraid of that. It's just what the Bible says. But let's be clear about it. One, all-powerful, all-knowing, eternal God. His name is Yahweh. Or maybe that's not actually pronouncing it right. We don't know if that's for sure the right way to pronounce it. But these other ones they're not eternal. They're not all-powerful. And the ones who rebelled are going to be judged.
Now, from the perspective of your book, it would seem that you take the view that there was a rebellion. And that God has a very systematic, but to us, a very long-term program of dealing with this rebellion. And, of course, the whole Bible is about the rebellion and about the solution to the problem. And the new heavens and the new earth at the end of the book. I love that part.
Me too. I can't wait.
I can't either. But in a way, your book is dealing with the rebellion. From a perspective that I think most people don't take.
Yeah, I think what we've done in, I'm going to use this term again, but Western theology, and maybe the East does this as well, but especially since the days of the Reformation, we tend to look at Genesis 3. We call it the fall. And it clearly was the fall of man. But I think what you would see with ancient Hebrews, they wouldn't have just a singular fall. Not everything hinges on Genesis 3. You also have Genesis 6. There's another rebellion there. And you have Genesis 11. You have another rebellion there. And those three rebellions in Genesis 1 through 11 kind of shaped their worldview. Whereas what we do, because of what Paul talked about in Romans 5 and what he talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, we go back to the first Adam and his fall, and then, of course, our need for salvation, which that's extremely important, and absolutely we should talk about that. But we tend to minimize the other two, and we don't realize how much that shapes the worldview of the biblical writers.
Now, let's turn to another story. Everybody's familiar with Goliath.
Okay.
And David.
I get nervous around people named David. I know there's a podcast, people can't see me, but I'm about 6'9", so when I'm around Davids, I get nervous.
All right. I understand from the opposite point of view. Yeah. David is more than a hero. He's an incredibly complex human being, incredibly smart. He was used of God to do a number of different things, but everybody thinks about David and Goliath. And what was Goliath? Nephilim. And let's talk about that question and about that confrontation between David and Goliath and what it really means.
Yeah. It is one. I say I get nervous, but I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. It's one of my favorite passages. So Goliath is in 1 Samuel 17. He's not technically called a giant there. It does describe his size and his armaments and everything, but he is called a giant later on in Chronicles. It refers to him, the descendants of the giant or sons of the giant, that back to Goliath. But he is, if you think about in Joshua 11. You have Joshua driving out or wiping out the Amorites and then these other giant clans, the Anakim. It tells us, I think it's verse 21, that Joshua drove out the Anakim throughout the land, except for in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. So those three cities, the giants remained. Well, what do we read a few hundred years later? Who's still in Gath? that's where Goliath is from.
That's where he's from.
So he would be he would be a descendant of the Anakim. Yes, he's a Philistine nationally, but his genealogy, you go back through that, he's going to be part of the Anakim. And then of course, Numbers 13:33 tells us the Anakim are of the Nephilim. So he would be one of the Nephilim. Okay.
Now, having set that story, so what is the real import of the David and Goliath story? Set on the background of your book.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to that. So you have, of course, David, who is trusting God. And I mentioned earlier about the Yahweh versus the gods of the nations. Right. Even in that confrontation, that Goliath boasts and says he's going to feed him to the bird, or he's am I a dog? You come in with sticks. And David says, no, you've come against the God of Israel, and this day people are going to know who the true God is. And you see that confrontation even there between the one true God and these false gods that Goliath serves. And of course, David wins that battle. He's the one who trusts in God. And so God is showing how he is preserving and protecting his chosen people, the Israelites, so that they can eventually bring the Messiah about. Eventually, they can provide the scriptures for us, because God used them to, as Romans 3 talks about, record the oracles of God. And so all of that is so important to the rest of biblical history, what David is doing there. And of course, he's going to be the king of Israel after Saul dies, right, and after Saul's son Ishbosheth. A lot of people miss that. David wasn't the second king of Israel. He's the third. Saul was the first, and then Saul's son Ishbosheth ruled Israel for 2 years while David was ruling Judah. But he's the first one. The second one to take it for a while. And
in a kind of a lighthearted way, there is a high-tech aspect to that battle, because Goliath had all these incredibly heavy weapons, and he represents brute force. David has high-tech. He's got a sling, and if you know anything about slings, and of course David the shepherd would protect his flock from wolves with his sling. Mm-hmm. And he got to be, and by the way, there are slingers who are incredibly accurate. Yeah. In fact, the Roman army used slingshots.
Well, and I think people in our day misunderstand. They think these little steel BBs that were used. No. If you can see them, if you go to the Museum of the Bible, they have a pile of these. If you go to Israel, you can see them. These things are almost the size of tennis balls. Yeah. They're like somewhere between golf ball and tennis ball size. If you get hit by one of those going with a sling, you can throw that about 120 to 140 miles an hour. You get hit with one of those, you're going to have a bad day. It might be your last day.
It'll be your last, as it was for Goliath. Yeah. And so David, the man whom God is backing in this contest, has a lot of aspects that kind of come down to us. And, we have echoes of the battle of David and Goliath going on even today and on into the tribulation. And David won. Mm-hmm. And he always will. But again, there's the giant. There were giants in those days, and also after that. So how big was Goliath, and what lineage did he come from?
Yeah, so it says he's a Philistine, but as I mentioned before, he is of the Anakim. That's where
of the Anakim.
Yeah, they're still from Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. The Anakim were still there in Joshua 11. So the Anakim are from Anak, and it talks about Arba is mentioned in several places in Joshua and Judges. He was the greatest of the Anakim. So I don't know if he's the forefather of the Anakim. We don't know who he is, but every time his name is mentioned, whether as his name or as part of the city, the Kiryat Arba, it tells us something else about him. It will always have a parenthetical after it. So it's like the Israelites, the Hebrews, knew who that was, and he was a prominent figure. We don't know today who Arba was, other than the mightiest or the first of the Anakim. We're not sure. So that's where Goliath came from. That was his. And as far as how big was he, so I have a whole chapter in the book about how tall were the Nephilim. You see these pictures on the internet where skeletons of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet tall. Right. And I roll my eyes at that a little bit, not because I doubt God's power or anything like that. It's there are limits as far as we know to size. So, for example, I'm let's use me and Og. So Og is the last of the reference. He's the king that is killed in Deuteronomy 2 that he's mentioned. And it says his bedstead was an iron bedstead. And indeed, it was 9 cubits by 4 cubits. So roughly 13 and a half feet long by 6 feet wide. We don't know if he was as tall as his bed was long, but let's assume that for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
That would make him 13 and a half feet tall, which is exactly twice my height. I'm 6'9".
Wow.
And I'm about 2.
And by the way, folks, when I stand
You're not 6'9".
When I stand beside Tim, I disappear.
Well, and when the last shall become first and first shall be last, I'm going to have hair and you're going to be tall. How's that?
So, yeah.
So my point, he's exactly twice my height. I'm 230 pounds. So in order for a person to be built to my dimensions, the same as I am, if you double my height, he doesn't become 460 pounds. You have to multiply that by a figure of 8. He becomes 1,820 pounds.
Wow.
Because you have to double the width, you have to double the length and the depth. So you have to multiply that by eight times. So if you're going to say that somebody's 13 and a half feet tall at my size, which I'm fairly thin now, thankfully. I used to be over 250, but and more. But it's 1,800 pounds. Imagine a heart pumping that long. Imagine human bones trying to handle that weight. Now, the compressive strength of bone, where you're just putting weight straight down, can hold that weight. But the tensile strength, so when you're moving and you're twisting, bone's not really good at that. And when you're talking about that much weight, it's going to create all sorts of problems. So I think there is an upper limit. I think 13 and a half is probably too tall. If you look at what Goliath is talked about in some of the texts, he's about 9'9". You look at some of the ancient Egyptian records and even some of their artwork. I think it puts them in like the 8 to 10 foot range. It talked about these. Right. The Egyptians had a document that talked about I think it was about the Shasu, who it says it would translate to about 8'10" from nose to toe. And so that's something an ancient Egyptian talked about.
I'm going to bring up another subject, which really kind of fits here, but Genesis 14, we have Abraham coming up against 4 Gentile kings, and they make war with him. And we won't talk about the kings, but if you drop down to Genesis 14:5, you have the Rephaims, the Zuzims, the Amims, and a couple of other species or lineages of giants. And how would these fit with Goliath? We're talking about Goliath right now.
Yeah, so those individual clans are mentioned again. Several of them are mentioned in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. So the Emim dwelt in the land, and God says, but he drove them out. They were a people as great and as tall as the Anakim. So again, he's calling them giants. The Zuzim are mentioned there, but they're called the Zamzumim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. Again, a people great and tall as the Anakim, they were driven out. And the Horites are mentioned in both places. It never specifically calls them giants, but they're always mentioned in the same context. Yeah. I think they probably were. And then the Amorites are also considered to be giants. They're called that in Amos, way back in the book of Amos. It talks about them. Their height was like the height of the oak tree, that kind of thing. So they're giants.
So I guess my point for bringing this up is with David and Goliath, you're talking about a metaphor of Israel coming against this giant force. And again, in Genesis 14, Abram is going up against forces and even giant forces. And the giant forces we think of as non-human or somehow connected with something a little bit powerful, something that you would hate to take on as a mere human being. These people have got special powers and special strengths, put it that way. And so you have these battles, these incredible battles. But what do they represent metaphorically? Because these giants, I think, are a metaphor for the forces of Satan in a way.
Well, I'm sure they can be used that way if we were to. I don't know. I know you're not spiritualizing the text because you believe there were real giants there, which I do too. And so, in the sense that, like with David, we can talk about how we know when we depend on the Lord, when we're trusting in Him, He is faithful to fulfill His promises. That doesn't always mean that we're going to win every single battle physically, that we're going to make our mortgage payment on time, we're going to do whatever. It doesn't, God doesn't promise all those things to us, but He does guarantee that those who have trusted in Him, those who place their faith in Christ, are going to be raised to life at the last day. We're going to dwell with Him eternally, and there will be no more tears, no more sorrow, no more pain. That's that new heaven and new earth you were talking about.
Yes.
And so all of those things are promises to us. And also, even in this life, we can have joy. We can have peace of the Lord and peace from the Lord, peace with the Lord, all three of those things, which are so important. And so I think even in the midst of whatever this world throws at us, no matter how dark it gets, we can trust that, one, our Savior's already been through it, and He's done it all without sin, and He gives us the Holy Spirit to empower us to live godly lives, and we can remain faithful to the Lord during that.
Now, your chapter 10 here, the fallen angel view, is Jewish, given Jewish support. And in chapter 11, the fallen angel view, early Christian support. Coming on into the Christian era, what has been the history of belief in the fallen angels?
Yeah, so this topic, the early church fathers, anybody who wrote on the topic for the first 2 centuries, held to the fallen angel view. They all acknowledged that these were angels who came down, married women, and had children, and the giants were from them. So that is found in multiple early church fathers' writings. It's not until about the 300s. I think there's one in the middle of the 200s, but then around the 300s, you start to see this shift to more of an allegorical interpretation. And that's what happened with the Jewish writers in the beginning of the 2nd century. They started to adopt an allegorical approach, and suddenly it was, which is kind of ironic, because they will accuse the people like me who hold to the fallen angel view. They say, oh, you're borrowing from Greek mythology. Actually, they're the ones borrowing from the Greeks. The allegorical approach came from the Greeks. And do you know why it was developed? The philosophers back in the 5th and 6th centuries BC, the Greek people loved Homer and Hesiod and all these myths that they had. You think about the Odyssey, you think of Zeus and all. But when you started to get to more of a philosophical age, you think about what the gods were doing. Zeus is leaving Olympus to come down and have affairs with women, and the gods are pretty foul characters when you really stop and think about it. And so a way to rescue those writings, rather than just dispose them and throw them on the ash heap of history, was to allegorize them, say, no, Zeus just represents the wind, or he represents some force. And so they started to come up with different meanings. Actually, that's what the word allegory is, like other wording, other interpretation. And so they started to come up with a different way to interpret the text in a way that was not consistent with what the word actually means. And then that became popular down in Alexandria, which was the Greek center of learning for some time besides Athens. And if you look at where all the allegory comes from in the Jewish writings, you have Philo from Alexandria. And then from a lot of the Christian writing, it also flowed out of Alexandria. So you have this allegorical approach to scripture where the words don't actually mean what we think they mean. They mean something else. And that's what happened with the sons of God and the Nephilim. It no longer is exactly what we think it means. It has to be something else because we don't like what it says.
And what does it really say?
What it really says is that there were angels who rebelled against God, and they had children with women, and those children, the offspring, were giants. For whatever reason, we don't know why an angel and human coming together that way would create giants. I don't know the DNA involved there.
Exactly. But you do hold to the veracity of these narratives.
Right. And even if, I know sometimes people will say, well, but why would God allow that? That's just disgusting. It's like, well, first of all, God allows a lot of things that are evil to happen. But the whole idea of that's disgusting, it can't happen. I think people have the wrong idea of what fallen angels are. We tend to think of more of like a horned, toady, warty kind of creature that would just, would scare you to death if you saw it or something like that. But if there was one who was coming to try to deceive you, don't you think they would appear in a very appealing manner.
Sure.
I mean, you think about the way that it's portrayed in film, where you have a similar storyline. The movie Bedazzled, the newer one that's a remake, you have Elizabeth Hurley as playing the devil, tempting at. Well, of course, you're going to have a beautiful woman there, or you have Chris Hemsworth playing Thor, who Jane falls in love with. And he's a
By the way, I'm glad you brought that up, because that shows the secular infatuation with this same story. Mm-hmm. The Thor series of movies that are very, very, very popular. Probably most of the teenagers in the early 20s have seen those movies, mm-hmm. and they've absorbed that idea, that the gods are, just pretty good people.
You even have that in Guardians of the Galaxy has the same thing, where the second film, the guy, Chris Pratt's father, played by Kurt Russell, is viewed as a god, and he goes around to these different planets and is sleeping with different women and producing offspring, and that. So that same idea, but they're appealing characters in the sense that they're visually appealing. They're not going to be these horrible, gross. Now, from a spiritual perspective, we know who they are, and that's disgusting. But from just a physical perspective, they're not going to appear in the most vile form that you can imagine. Satan manifests as an angel of light, and so it's no wonder if his ministers do the same.
Mm-hmm. Now, so really, this mythology has leaped forward into our era, our contemporary era, and is kind of a, if you will, satanic propaganda, in my opinion. And for those who do not know the Lord and who are infatuated with the whole idea of outer space and powers and acquiring various kinds of power, and wow, I wish I could meet one of those people who could impart some of his powers to me, and boy, would I ever do some wonderful things if I had those powers. And that whole mythology has kind of crept into our culture.
I think it's part of God putting eternity in our hearts. We long for something bigger and grander than ourselves, and yet our culture has been so deceived to the point where, well, it's not the Bible. It's not what the Bible tells us. It's got to be something else, and they will believe anything, no matter how outlandish or bizarre, but the truth. The truth is the true Son of God, the actual Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ, became one of us.
Yes.
And he took on human flesh, and he was born as a baby in Bethlehem. He had his diapers changed. He grew up and grew in wisdom and knowledge and stature, and he, in favor with the Lord, as Luke tells us, he was tempted in all ways that we are, and yet without sin. And then he did the most amazing thing ever. He went to the cross and died in our place. He took the most horrifying death that we can ever imagine, was beaten mercilessly, and went to the cross and took our place. That's what we deserve. We've all rebelled against our Creator. We deserve that. And yet God himself said, I'll take it. I'll do it. And it's not over. 3 days later, I'm going to rise from the dead, and I'm going to show you what's going to happen to you if you believe. And you can't plumb the depths of God's love, as you said before. It's incredible. And nobody would make up that story.
No, they would not. And as you're sort of telling that story, recounting that, what comes to my mind is one of the most impressive scriptural statements in the entire Bible in 1 John. And it's 3 little words. And the 3 words are, God is love.
Mm. It says it twice.
It says it twice. Yeah. You're exactly right. And that's kind of a throwaway line, like God is love. Wait a minute, that's huge.
That's huge.
It's
especially in our day, because if you look at, Jesus told his disciples shortly before he was arrested and everything, all men will know you are my disciples if you have the best theological arguments, if you fight and argue with your brothers all the time. No, if you have love for one another. Right. A new commandment I give you, love one another. That's what we've been commanded to do. And, as a church, a lot of times we fail at that, loving fellow believers because they might have different theological views than us. And I think it's a shame, because the Bible, Jesus is very clear. People will know, the outside world is going to know you're my followers if you have love for one another. If we want to reach this lost and dying culture, then let's show them who God is. God is love. Let's show them what that really looks like, and treat fellow brothers and sisters in Christ with love and respect. It doesn't mean that there's not correction. Of course there is, but it's done in a spirit of gentleness, as Galatians 6 talks about. And so that's an issue that's been really close to my heart lately. I've been in the middle of writing an article on it. I think it's so important for us to take Jesus seriously when he says that.
Well, if you're writing an article on it, we might be able to print that in the Prophecy Watcher. That sounds like a great article. But as we look at the big picture, or maybe I should say the huge picture of the Nephilim, the demigods, people who tried to assume the power of God, and they tried to take the earth by force. And by the way, they're still trying. Those principalities and powers are still at work. Really, this entire subject becomes a question of the love of God versus the revolutionary power of human beings under the guidance of Satan, still trying to rebel, still trying to create another superior culture. And by the way, that's, I guess, behind everything we see today, the strive toward Marxism, communism. It's all backed by these ancient conflicts that we read about in the Bible. Only it's coming to us in a slightly modified form.
Oh,
today.
yeah, it gets repackaged all the time. And there's a reason why Marxism is very much anti-Christian. Marx himself was very clear on that issue. And so you see in our culture today a lot of this, what we call neo-Marxism, whether it's the critical gender theory or critical race theory or all the other ones.
Yes.
They're all part of a neo-Marxist worldview that is attacking anything of a Judeo-Christian foundation of our culture, because if you can destroy the family, if you can destroy the church, you're going to bring down the country. And that's what they want, as much conflict as possible. They want to separate everybody, any means possible. And yet the Bible talks about how good it is when brothers can dwell in unity. And what we talked about just a little bit ago, that Christians are supposed to have love for one another. And by the way, we're also commanded to love our enemy. We're also commanded to love our family. And can you think of anybody outside of that? Love one another, love your neighbor, love your enemy. I think that includes everybody.
I think it does.
So I think
pretty
that's
much
what we're commanded
does.
to do.
And again, we have an opportunity these days, I think, to practice that as never before. The author, Tim Chaffey, and the book is a very detailed book about the sons of God, the Nephilim, this ancient battle that's been going on. If you want clarity, if you want the detailed aspects of this revolution that's been going on for how many thousand years now, and
since before the flood. So
before the flood,
yeah.
And if you really want to read about the details, Tim's done some amazing research here.
Thank you.
What are you working on now, by the way?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked, because I think the project I'm working on at work at the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum is something that you guys are going to love. We are building a huge model of first century Jerusalem from the time of Jesus.
Really?
So it's going to be about 40 feet by 60 feet. So it's not as large as the one that you see at the Israel Museum today, but that's from AD 66, and it's all made out of the same material. It's not populated at all, so it's hard to see the scale. What we're doing is actually putting more than 15,000 little figures in there. We're putting all the greenery. It's going to be the most accurate model of Jerusalem anywhere in the world.
Now, this is the Jerusalem of Jesus' time.
Yeah, so from 33 AD.
Wow.
So,
now, I don't think anybody's ever done that I can think of.
Not that I know of. We're working with experts, even the curator of the museum, or the Israel Museum, who's the curator of that exhibit, that huge model. We've been working with him, contracted with him to look over some of our stuff. We have been digging through excavation reports and everything we can to get it exactly right. In fact, when I finished my doctorate back in May, my dissertation was on a historical study of Jerusalem from circa 33 AD and comparing it to today. So, when you go there today, they say, here's the Via Dolorosa where Jesus, no, that's on the wrong side of town. It's actually over here. And even if it was here, you'd be 20 feet lower. So it's not that you can't have a profound spiritual experience there. Of course you can.
Well, having gone to Israel, of course, the steps at the south end of the southwest, I guess it is, southwest end of the temple that go up into the southern platform. People say that Jesus actually may have walked on those steps. So I got a chance to walk up those steps, and I walked up there and I thought about this. Wow, What a thing.
We were there a year ago, and there were 4 of us on the team that went there, and we walked on what's called the Pilgrimage Road from the Pool of Siloam, and they're excavating right now. We were led by the archaeologist who's doing it. And yeah, some of those steps are first century. You're walking where Jesus walked after he would have healed the blind man. And it's people, pretty soon that road's going to open up, maybe in about 5 years, and people can go there. But what people won't be able to do there that they can do what we're doing, you're still going to be a lot of times on top of 20 to 30 feet of rock and sediment. We're going to be showing people what it actually looked like in Jesus' time and doing a lot of teaching there. So I can't wait for that to happen.
I want to see that.
Yeah.
Are you going to make a book? So
probably several of them. Yeah. I'm working on one right now.
So you could, I guess, thumb through and see all these places. That's terrific. May the Lord speed your work.
Oh, thank you so much.
His name is Tim Chaffey. He's written Fallen, the Sons of God, and the Nephilim. And by the way, it's a good read, and I suggest it. And may the Lord bless your